Every man deserves to grow old in peace, to sit by his fire without looking over his shoulder. But sometimes the world won't let an old warrior rest, no matter how many battles he's already fought. The thieves thought they knew what they'd find in the forest longhouse, an easy target, alone and helpless. They had heard Sten the Silent hadn't lifted a weapon in 20 years. What they didn't know was that some men never truly retire from war. As they kicked down his door, laughing and ready to take what they pleased, they found the legendary Sten Stormborn waiting. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside the grey-bearded giant were 2 black wolves, eyes gleaming in the firelight. The thieves had come for silver and found something far more valuable, a lesson they'd never forget. But what had kept these deadly companions loyal to an old warrior for so many years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines like memories of forgotten battles, and Sten Eriksson, once called Stormborn by those who fought beside him, sat by his hearth as he had for countless dawns before. His massive frame, though bent slightly by the weight of 70 winters, still filled the carved wooden chair that had been his grandfather's. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with remnants of a life lived in service to kings and country. Above the stone hearth hung his weathered war axe, its blade still sharp despite decades of disuse. The handle bore the smooth grooves worn by his grip through countless campaigns, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he could still feel its familiar weight in his calloused hands. But those days belonged to another man, one who had traded his sword for solitude and found peace in the simple rhythms of forest life. Fenris lifted his great black head from where he lay, sprawled across the threshold, ears twitching at some distant sound only he could hear. The wolf was larger than most men expected, his shoulders reaching Sten's waist when standing. Beside him, equally massive, skulls stretched and yawned, revealing teeth that could crush bone with casual ease. To the villagers below, they were merely rumors, stories told to frighten children about the mad hermit who lived with beasts. To Sten, they were family, the only companions who had chosen to follow him into exile. The longhouse itself told stories to those who knew how to read them. Hand-hewn timbers bore the scars of age and weather, but beneath the weathered exterior lay craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and status from another time. The great hall could have housed 20 warriors in comfort, its tables carved from single oak trunks, its walls hung with tapestries that had once graced royal chambers. Now it served as sanctuary for one old man and his wolves, its vast spaces filled with the gentle sounds of a life deliberately made simple. Sten rose from his chair with the careful deliberation of age, his joints protesting the movement with familiar aches. At 6 feet and 8 inches, he still commanded presence, though his once golden hair had turned silver white and his beard now reached nearly to his chest. The scars that mapped his arms and torso told their own stories. Here a Saxon blade, there a Danish axe, each mark a memory of violence survived and enemies defeated. He moved to the great oak table where yesterday's bread waited alongside cheese he had made himself and ale brewed in the old way. The simple pleasure of breaking his fast had become a ritual of gratitude, each bite a reminder that he had lived long enough to enjoy such peace. Outside, the forest stirred with morning life, and through the small windows he could see the mist beginning to lift from the valley below. The wolves followed him with their eyes but remained at rest, content in the knowledge that their territory was secure. They had patrolled the borders of their domain before dawn, as was their custom, and found no threats worthy of concern. It had been months since anyone had ventured near enough to require their attention, and longer still since any had approached with ill intent. Sten had chosen this isolation carefully, selecting a location remote enough to discourage casual visitors but accessible enough that trade goods could still find their way to him. A narrow path wound down from the longhouse to the river valley, where twice yearly a merchant named Eric brought supplies in exchange for the furs and carved goods that Sten produced during the long winter months. It was a simple arrangement that suited both men. Eric gained quality goods at fair prices, and Sten maintained his connection to the world below without having to endure its complexities. The merchant was one of the few who knew the truth about Sten's identity, though he had sworn on his children's lives never to speak of it. To Eric, Sten was simply a skilled craftsman who preferred solitude, a story that satisfied the curious without revealing the legend that slept within these walls. There had been others over the years who suspected: a traveling skald who claimed to recognize the voice, a former soldier who studied Sten's scars too carefully. But the wolves had ways of discouraging such inquiries that left no room for doubt about the value of discretion. 20 years had passed since Sten last answered a call to war, 20 years since he had stood in the shield wall or felt the thunder of charging cavalry beneath his feet. The world had moved on without him, new kings rising and falling, new wars fought over the same old grievances. He had given 4 decades of his life to such struggles, had seen his shield brothers fall one by one until he alone remained of the company that had once seemed invincible. The decision to leave had not come easily. Honor demanded that a warrior die with sword in hand, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. But wisdom, hard won through years of watching younger men make the same mistakes he had made, whispered of another path. There were different kinds of strength to be found in knowing when to walk away, different kinds of victory in choosing life over glory. Skoll rose and padded to the door, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace that marked his kind. His nose twitched as he tested the air, and Sten noted the subtle change in his posture. Not alarm, not yet, but awareness. Something moved in their territory, though whether bird, beast, or man remained unclear. "What do you smell, old friend?" Sten asked, his voice carrying the gentle tone he reserved for his companions. The wolf glanced back at him, intelligent yellow eyes conveying a message that needed no words. Visitors approached, still distant but drawing nearer with each passing moment. Sten felt the familiar stirring in his chest, the quickening of pulse that had once preceded battle. Age had not dulled his instincts, though 20 years of peace had taught him patience. There were many reasons why men might venture into the deep forest: hunters following game trails, merchants seeking shortcuts, even lost travelers following rumors of a hermit's hospitality. Most posed no threat, and those who did usually announced their intentions long before reaching his door. But today felt different. Fenris had joined his brother at the threshold, both wolves alert but not yet agitated. Their posture spoke of strangers moving with purpose rather than wandering by chance, of multiple footsteps where honest travelers usually came alone or in small groups. Sten set down his wooden cup and moved to the narrow window that faced the path, his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. The forest kept its secrets well, revealing nothing to casual observation. But Sten had not survived 40 years of warfare by relying on his eyes alone. He closed them and listened with the focused intensity that had saved his life more times than he could count. There, the crack of a branch beneath an unwary foot, the rustle of cloth against leaves, the soft murmur of voices too distant to understand, but close enough to confirm his wolf's warning. 6 men, perhaps 7, moving together but not in formation. Their progress spoke of stealth attempted but not achieved, of men who knew enough to try for silence but lacked the skill to accomplish it. Hunters might move so clumsily, but hunters would not murmur among themselves while stalking prey. These were men with different intentions, men who spoke because they believed themselves unobserved. Sten moved to the great chest that sat beside his sleeping alcove, its iron bindings green with age but still strong. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay reminders of the man he had been. His fingers found the familiar weight of his sayax, the long knife that had been his constant companion through campaigns across the known world. The blade emerged from its sheath with the whispered song of steel on leather, its edge still sharp enough to part silk or split bone with equal ease. The wolves watched him with interest but no alarm. They had seen this transformation before, the subtle shift from peaceful hermit to something altogether more dangerous. It was not fear that motivated them, but anticipation, the primal satisfaction of predators whose domain faced challenge. 20 years of peace had been a gift, Sten reflected as he tested the knife's balance. 20 years to rest, to heal, to discover who he might become without the weight of other men's wars upon his shoulders. But peace was not the natural state of the world, and gifts from the gods always came with a price. Perhaps today was the day when that debt would be collected. He returned the sayax to its sheath, but kept it close, the familiar weight a comfort against what might come. The visitors would arrive soon, their clumsy progress through the forest guaranteed it, and when they did, he would greet them as custom demanded. But if they came seeking the weak old hermit of village gossip, they would find instead Sten Stormborn, and learn why some legends never truly die. The wolves sensed the change in him and rose to their feet, ready to follow wherever their pack leader might lead. Together, they had weathered 20 winters of peace. If the gods willed it, they would weather whatever storm approached with the same unity that had sustained them through all the quiet years. 3 miles down the mountain path, where the river bent through stands of birch and alder, 7 men huddled around the cold ashes of their morning fire. The silver arm ring that had started their troubles gleamed dully in grim Bloodhand's scarred palm, its intricate knotwork catching what little sunlight filtered through the canopy above. "Tell me again about the old man," Grim commanded, his voice carrying the harsh rasp of a throat damaged by too much shouting and too little care. At 43, he had lived longer than most men of his profession, though the years showed in every line of his weathered face and every careful movement of joints that had been broken and mended too many times to count. Bjorn the weasel shifted uncomfortably on the fallen log that served as his seat. He was the youngest of their band at barely 20 summers, his beard still patchy and his eyes holding the nervous energy of a man trying to prove himself worthy of dangerous company. The merchant Eric spoke truly, I swear it. An old giant lives alone up there, keeps to himself, trades furs for supplies twice yearly. No wife, no sons, no visitors save for trade. And the silver? Grim's fingers closed around the arm ring, feeling its substantial weight. The piece was old work, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of royal workshops and wealthy patrons. Such things did not find their way to hermits through honest means. Eric had 3 such rings when he came down from the mountain. Bjorn continued, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to convince. Said the old man had more, much more. Arm rings, torques, even Roman coins from the old empire. A treasure hoard, hidden away where no one thinks to look. Magnus Ironbeard spat into the ashes, his scarred hands working to sharpen a blade already keen enough to split hairs. Of all Grim's companions, he was the most practical, a man who had survived 30 years of raiding through careful planning and healthy suspicion. And why would a merchant tell you such things? Men who trade in the deep forest learn to keep quiet about their roots. Bjorn's face flushed red above his scraggly beard. He didn't mean to tell. Was drunk, deep in his cups at Hakon's tavern, bragging about his profits. Said the old fool up the mountain didn't know the true value of what he traded away. Drunk men lie, Magnus observed without looking up from his blade, and young men hear what they wish to hear. The silver is real enough, Grim said, holding up the arm ring. He had purchased it from the merchant himself, paying 3 times what such work might bring in the southern markets. But Eric had spoken truly. It was ancient work, the kind that came from hoards accumulated over generations. The question is whether there's more where this came from. Thorvald the Red, so named for the birthmark that covered half his face like spilled blood, leaned forward with interest. Even if there's only a little, it's more than we'll see from robbing farmers and travelers. Winter's coming, and we've had poor hunting these past months. The other men nodded agreement. They were desperate men, each driven to outlawry by circumstances beyond their control. Thorvald had killed a man in fair combat, but lacked the silver to pay Wergild to the victim's family. Einar One-Eye had lost his farm to a harsh winter and harsher taxes. Gunnar the Thin had been cast out from his village for allegedly stealing grain during a famine. Young Bjorn sought adventure and found only hardship. They were not evil men, merely hungry ones, but hunger could drive good men to evil acts when winter pressed close and options grew few. "What of defenses?" Magnus asked, setting aside his whetstone. A man wealthy enough to own such treasures might be wealthy enough to hire protection. "None that Eric mentioned," Bjorn replied. "Just an old man living alone with his memories. Some say he keeps animals, hunting hounds, perhaps. But what threat could such creatures pose to armed men?" Grim studied the faces around him, reading the mixture of greed and desperation that marked men willing to gamble their lives for a chance at easy wealth. They had been together for 2 seasons now, bound by shared need and the kind of loyalty that existed among men who had nowhere else to turn. None were cowards, though neither were any of them particularly skilled warriors. "We'll scout the place first," he decided. "Learn the ground, watch his habits, make certain he's as alone and helpless as the merchant claimed. If the opportunity presents itself cleanly, we take it. If not, we withdraw and seek easier prey." The men began preparing their gear with the practiced efficiency of experienced outlaws. Weapons were checked, packs lightened to essentials, and the remaining evidence of their camp scattered to the winds. They moved like men who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to disappear quickly when circumstances demanded. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails and old paths known only to hunters and outlaws, the forest around them grew quiet in ways that should have warned of danger. Birds fell silent at their approach and did not resume singing after they passed. Small creatures that should have been foraging in the underbrush remained hidden in their burrows. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very trees were watching their progress, but the men were focused on their goal and their fears, imagining gods that did not exist and resistance they were prepared to overcome. They missed the signs that would have sent wiser men fleeing back to the safety of the valley below. Grim called a halt when they reached the ridge above the longhouse, motioning for silence as they crept to positions that offered clear views of their target. The building was larger than expected, its construction speaking of wealth and careful craftsmanship. Smoke rose from the central chimney, and the grounds around the structure showed the kind of care that suggested permanent habitation rather than seasonal use. "Big place for one old man," Thorvald whispered, his scarred face creased with doubt. "All the better for us," Grim replied, though privately he shared the concern. The merchant's description had suggested a simple cabin, not this substantial hall that could house a dozen men in comfort. They watched for the better part of an hour, noting the patterns of smoke from the fire, the arrangement of outbuildings, and the paths that led to and from the main structure. No guards appeared, no servants moved about their duties. If anyone dwelt within those walls, they kept to themselves with the discipline of hermits or the caution of men who had reason to avoid notice. There, Bjorn pointed toward a window where a shadow had moved across the opening. "Someone's home!" The shadow had been large, Grim noted, confirming the merchant's description of a giant among men. But size meant little when age had stolen strength and numbers favored the attackers. 7 against 1 offered odds that even a legendary warrior might find difficult to overcome. As evening approached and their observation revealed no additional threats, Grim gathered his men for final planning. They would wait until full dark, then approach from the blind side of the building, where no windows faced the forest. A quick rush would see them inside before any alarm could be raised, and superior numbers would settle the matter before their victim could mount effective resistance. It was a simple plan, the kind that had served them well in the past. None of them considered that simplicity itself might be a trap, or that the very ease of their approach might be deliberately allowed by someone far more dangerous than they imagined. The silver arm-ring felt heavy in Grim's palm as he studied the peaceful scene below. Soon, he told himself, they would have more treasure than such a simple peace. Soon, their troubles would be over and winter would hold no terrors for men wealthy enough to buy warm clothes and full bellies. But even as he planned their assault, some primitive part of his mind whispered warnings he chose not to hear. The forest was too quiet, the approach too easy, and the silence from the longhouse too complete. Somewhere in the depths of his warrior's instincts, alarms sounded that his conscious mind dismissed as cowardice. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and 7 desperate men prepared to learn why legends lived longer than the men who dismissed them as mere stories. The carved wooden shield hanging beside the great hearth had taken 3 Danish axes during the siege of Stamford Bridge, its oak surface scarred but unbroken after 40 years of weather and memory. Sten's eyes found it now in the firelight as the sound of approaching footsteps finally reached his ears with unmistakable clarity. 7 men, moving with the careful stealth of hunters who had never learned that true predators moved in silence. He rose from his chair with deliberate calm, his massive frame unfolding to its full height as Fenris and Skoll flanked him on either side. The wolves required no command. They had sensed the approach long before their human companion and had already positioned themselves for whatever might come. Their yellow eyes fixed on the heavy oak door, ears forward, muscles coiled beneath their black fur. The footsteps stopped just outside the threshold. Sten could hear whispered consultation, the nervous breathing of men working themselves toward violence. He had heard such sounds 1,000 times before, in the moments before shield walls clashed and blood painted the earth. Time stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, each second filled with the weight of choices not yet made. When the assault came, it came with the crash of iron against oak and the splintering of wood that had stood for decades without giving way. The great door, built to withstand winter storms and the occasional bear, buckled under repeated blows from axes wielded by desperate men. Ancient iron hinges groaned in protest before finally surrendering, and the barrier that had protected Sten's sanctuary collapsed inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. 7 silhouettes filled the doorway, backlit by dying sunlight and armed with the desperate fury of men who believed they fought for survival. At their head stood a scarred figure whose bearing spoke of leadership earned through violence rather than birth. His eyes swept the interior of the longhouse, taking in the rich furnishings and obvious wealth before settling on the giant who waited beside the hearth. "Well now," Grim Bloodhand said, his voice carrying forced cheer that failed to mask the tension beneath. "What have we here? Just an old man by his fire, alone and undefended as promised." Sten said nothing, his pale blue eyes studying each invader with the calculating gaze of a warrior assessing threats. The leader was experienced, his scars and bearing marked him as a veteran of many fights. The others showed varying degrees of skill and desperation, but all carried themselves like men familiar with violence, if not necessarily proficient at it. "You know why we're here, old man," Grim continued, stepping carefully into the hall while his companions spread to either side. "Eric the merchant has been telling tales about your wealth, about treasures you keep hidden away like a dragon hoarding gold. Share with us, and we'll leave you in peace to enjoy your remaining years." The wolves remained motionless beside Sten, their presence so still and silent that the thieves seemed not to notice them among the shadows cast by the flickering fire. Only their eyes moved, tracking the movements of the intruders with predatory focus. Skoll's nostrils flared slightly, reading the scent of fear sweat and old blood that clung to men who lived by violence. "I am Sten Eriksson," the giant said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to command. "This is my home. You are not welcome here." Bjorn the Weasel laughed nervously from his position near the door. "Sten Eriksson? Never heard of him. You're just an old hermit with more silver than sense, keeping honest men from their fair share when winter comes calling." Fair share. Sten's tone remained level, but something shifted in his posture that made the wolf's ears twitch with anticipation. "What have you done to earn a share of what I have built with my own hands?" Thorvald the Red hefted his axe with practiced ease, the iron head catching the firelight. "We're earning it now, old man. 7 against 1. Those are odds even a giant can't overcome. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sten's gaze moved slowly across the faces before him, reading the mixture of greed and desperation that had driven them to his door. He had seen such expressions before, worn by men who believed that need justified any action, that poverty excused any crime. Some could be reasoned with, turned aside by wisdom or warned away by strength. Others would learn only through harder lessons. "I will give you one chance," Sten said, his voice carrying across the hall with quiet finality. "Leave now, and trouble me no more. Take nothing that is not freely given, harm nothing that rests under my protection, and you may depart with your lives intact." Magnus Ironbeard spat contemptuously, his scarred hands tightening on his weapon. Pretty words from a man with no way to back them up. "Where are your guards, hermit? Where are the warriors who would die to protect your horde?" As if summoned by the question, Fenris stepped forward into the circle of firelight, his massive form materializing from the shadows like something out of ancient legend. At full height, his shoulders reached Sten's waist, and the firelight revealed the powerful muscles that rippled beneath his midnight fur. His lips pulled back to expose fangs that gleamed like polished ivory, and a low growl rumbled from his throat like distant thunder. The thieves recoiled instinctively, hands tightening on weapons as primitive fear warred with human reason. Skull joined his pack brother, moving with the fluid grace that marked his kind as apex predators, his yellow eyes fixed on the nearest intruder with unwavering intensity. "Hounds," Einar One-Eye breathed, though his single remaining eye showed he recognized something far more dangerous than any domestic animal. "He keeps hunting hounds." "Wolves," Sten corrected gently. "And they are not kept. They choose to remain." Grim forced himself to stand straight, despite the primal urges that screamed at him to flee. He had not survived 30 years of violence by giving in to fear, no matter how well-founded it might prove. "Wolves or hounds? They're just beasts. Steel kills beasts as easily as it kills men." "You are welcome to test that theory," Sten replied, and for the first time, something like amusement touched his voice. "But I suspect you will find the lesson more costly than you anticipate." The standoff stretched between them, 7 desperate men facing one old warrior and his companions, neither side willing to make the first move that would transform threats into action. In that moment, hanging between words and violence, choices still remained that might lead away from bloodshed. But Bjorn the Weasel, driven by youth and desperation, and the need to prove himself worthy of his companion's respect, chose to end the waiting. With a cry that was part war shout and part fear-given voice, he lunged forward with his sayax aimed at Sten's heart, believing that bold action would carry the day and earn him glory in the songs yet to be sung. His blade never reached its target. Fenris moved like black lightning, intercepting the attack with jaws that closed on the young man's sword arm, with the sound of breaking bone. Bjorn's scream cut through the air as steel fell from nerveless fingers, and blood began to flow across the ancient floorboards of the longhouse. The battle had begun, and 7 thieves learned too late that some men never truly retire from war. They merely wait for war to find them again. The bone-handled sayax at Sten's belt had been forged in the workshops of Uppsala, its steel folded 7 times and blessed by priests of the old gods. He drew it now with a smooth motion of muscle memory older than conscious thought, the familiar weight settling into his palm like the hand of a long-lost friend. The blade whispered free of its sheath as Bjorn's screams echoed off the timber walls, and 4 decades of warfare awakened in a heartbeat. Grim Bloodhand recovered first from the shock of seeing his youngest companion dragged down by something that moved too fast for human eyes to follow. "Kill them," he roared, raising his own weapon as he charged toward the giant by the hearth. "Kill them all!" But Sten was no longer standing where Grim expected to find him. The old warrior had moved with startling speed for a man of his years, pivoting away from the direct assault while his sayax traced a silver arc through the firelit air. The blade found its mark below Grim's guard, sliding between ribs to pierce the lung beneath, and the outlaw leader's war cry dissolved into a wet gasp as steel found its home in flesh. Skoll had claimed Thorvald the Red before the scarred man could bring his axe to bear, powerful jaws closing on the thief's throat with surgical precision. There was no sport in it, no drawn-out struggle. Just the swift, efficient killing that marked predators who had learned their craft through generations of survival. Thorvald's axe fell from strengthless fingers as his lifeblood painted the wolf's muzzle crimson. Magnus Ironbeard proved himself the veteran his scars proclaimed, rolling away from Fenris's second attack and coming up with his blade extended in a defensive crouch. "Together!" he shouted to his surviving companions. "Rush him together, or we die one by one." The 3 remaining thieves, Magnus, Einar One-Eye, and Gunnar the Thin, formed a rough triangle around Sten and his wolves, their weapons creating a barrier of steel that glinted in the dancing firelight. They had witnessed enough to know that their original plan lay in ruins, but desperation drove them forward when wisdom would have counseled retreat. Sten shifted his stance, the sayax held low and ready, while his pale eyes tracked the movements of his enemies. The longhouse had become a battlefield, its peaceful atmosphere shattered by the iron scent of blood and the harsh breathing of men fighting for their lives. Overturned furniture marked the paths of combat, and the ancient floorboards grew slippery with crimson evidence of violence unleashed. "You should have listened," Sten said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "I offered you life. You chose differently." Einar One-Eye spat blood where a wolf's paw had caught his cheek during the initial rush. "Pretty words from a dead man. 3 of us still stand, hermit. Your pets can't be everywhere at once." As if to prove his words prophetic, the 3 thieves attacked, simultaneously, coming from different angles in a coordinated assault that spoke of hard-won experience in group combat. Magnus drove straight forward with his sword, while Einar circled left, and Gunnar attempted to flank from the right, their timing honed by seasons of fighting together against desperate odds. But they had never fought anything like Sten Stormborn in his prime, and age had stolen none of his tactical brilliance. The giant gave ground before Magnus's charge, drawing the veteran into overextending his attack, then pivoted sharply to intercept Einar's flanking maneuver. His sayax deflected the one-eyed man's thrust with a ringing clash of steel on steel, before the pommel of his weapon crushed Einar's remaining good eye in a spray of blood and vitreous fluid. Fenris dealt with Gunnar the Thin, the wolf's weight bearing the emaciated thief to the ground, where powerful jaws found the junction of neck and shoulder. Gunnar's death rattle joined the symphony of violence that filled the longhouse, his struggles growing weaker until they ceased altogether beneath the wolf's relentless grip. Only Magnus Ironbeard remained, backing toward the ruined doorway with his sword, weaving defensive patterns that spoke of genuine skill. Blood flowed from a dozen minor wounds where wolf claws had found gaps in his defense, but his eyes remained clear and his blade steady. Of all the thieves, he alone had recognized the true nature of their opposition and adjusted his tactics accordingly. "You're not just any hermit," he panted, his scarred face pale but determined. "I've seen warriors fight, and you move like a man who's killed more men than I've even met. Who are you, really?" Sten advanced slowly, his sayax held ready while Skoll circled to cut off any escape route. The wolf's muzzle dripped with the blood of enemies, but his yellow eyes remained fixed on the surviving thief with predatory patience. Behind them, Fenris maintained his grip on Bjorn's mangled arm, ensuring that the wounded young man posed no further threat. "I'm exactly who I said I was," Sten replied, his breathing barely elevated despite the violence of the past few minutes. "Sten Eriksson, a man who wishes only to live in peace but will not suffer thieves and murderers to trouble his home." Magnus laughed bitterly, though the sound held no humor. "Eriksson, I should have known. The merchant said the old man's name was Sten, but there are many Stens in the north. How was I to know he spoke of Sten Stormborn, shield brother to King Harald himself?" The admission hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Magnus had recognized the name too late to save his companions, but perhaps not too late to save himself. His sword remained ready, but his posture had shifted from attack to desperate defense. "You know who I am," Sten acknowledged. "Then you know what comes next." "I know the songs they sing," Magnus replied, his voice growing steadier as he accepted what must come. "Sten Stormborn never left enemies alive to trouble him twice. Sten Stormborn showed mercy only to those who earned it through honor in battle." The veteran thief straightened despite his wounds, bringing his sword up in formal salute. If he must die, he would die as a warrior rather than a cowering criminal. "I ask for nothing but a clean death, Lord. My companions chose poorly, but they were good men driven to evil by hard times." Sten studied the scarred face before him, reading the resigned dignity that marked a man who had found his courage at the end of all things. "You fought well, Magnus Ironbeard. Your blade was true, and your companions followed where you led. There is honor in that, even in service to a dark cause." The Sayax moved faster than thought, its keen edge finding the gap between Magnus's neck and shoulder in a stroke that granted the mercy of swift ending. The veteran fell without sound, his sword clattering to the blood-soaked floor as his life departed with quiet dignity. Silence returned to the longhouse, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Bjorn's labored breathing. 6 men lay dead among the ruins of Sten's peaceful evening, their blood seeping into floorboards that had known decades of tranquil solitude. In the private chamber beyond the great hall hung a faded battle standard, its crimson field now the color of old rust and its golden dragon barely visible after 40 years of careful preservation. Sten's eyes found it as he cleaned his Sayax with methodical precision, the ritual of weapon maintenance as automatic as breathing after a lifetime of warfare. The blood of Magnus Ironbeard came away easily from the folded steel, but the memories it awakened clung like morning mist to his thoughts. He had carried that banner through the siege of York, where he and 23 shield brothers held the north gate against 300 Danish berserkers. By the time relief arrived, only 7 still drew breath, and the gate remained unbroken. The dragon had flown proudly that day, its silk rippling in wind that carried the smoke of burning longships and the cries of dying men. Bjorn the weasel lay unconscious beside the hearth, his mangled arm bound with strips of cloth torn from his own tunic. Sten had seen to the wound with the same care he would have shown any injured creature. Wolf, bird, or foolish young thief made no difference to a man who had learned to value life through witnessing its easy destruction. The boy would live, though his sword arm would never again serve him as it once had. Fenris padded through the wreckage of overturned furniture, his massive paws stepping carefully around the pools of blood that marked where desperate men had fallen. The wolf's yellow eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of duty fulfilled and pack defended, but also a wariness that suggested the violence was not yet finished. His brother Skoll maintained position by the ruined door, ears alert for sounds that might herald the approach of additional threats. The longhouse felt different now, its peaceful atmosphere forever altered by the iron scent of battle and the memory of men who had died within its walls. Sten moved among the bodies with practiced efficiency, searching for anything that might reveal whether these thieves had companions waiting in the forest or families who would seek vengeance for their deaths. Magnus Ironbeard carried little beyond his weapons and a small pouch of silver coins, honest payment for honest work by the look of it, not the proceeds of robbery. The man had spoken truly when he claimed his companions were good men driven to evil by circumstances beyond their control. A folded parchment in his tunic bore the seal of Earl Olaf's steward, promising work in the spring for any willing to clear stones from new farmland. Honest work for honest pay, but spring remained months away, and winter pressed close with hungry teeth. Thorvald the Red bore the calloused hands of a skilled craftsman, though what trade he had followed remained unclear from his meager possessions. Einar One-Eye carried letters from a wife and children, their careful script speaking of love and worry for a father who had ventured forth to find the silver that might see them through the cold months ahead. Even young Bjorn's pack held more tools than weapons, the gear of a man who hoped to build rather than destroy. They were not evil men, Sten realized as he studied the evidence of their lives. Desperate, yes, and foolish in their choice of targets, but driven by need rather than malice. In another time, under different circumstances, they might have served as good soldiers or honest farmers. But winter cared nothing for good intentions, and hunger transformed decent men into creatures who would risk everything for the chance at easy wealth. The realization brought no comfort, only the familiar weight of a burden he had carried for 40 years. How many good men had he killed in service to kings and kingdoms? How many fathers and sons and brothers had fallen to his blade not because they were evil, but because they stood on the wrong side of some lord's ambitions? The dragon banner had flown over countless such deaths, and each one had carved its mark into his memory like runes cut deep in stone. He remembered the Battle of Brunanburh, where 10,000 men died in a single day over a dispute between cousins who shared the same grandfather. He had stood in the shield wall as waves of brave warriors broke against its iron face, watching boys barely old enough to grow beards full with their fathers' names on their lips. The victory songs called it glorious, but Sten recalled only the ravens that came after, so glutted with carrion that they could barely fly. There had been the siege of Chester, where hunger drove the defenders to such extremes that mothers drew lots to see whose children would die first to feed the rest. Sten had been among the relieving force that broke the siege, but not before he witnessed what desperation could drive good people to become. The memory of those hollow eyes and skeletal children haunted him still in the quiet hours before dawn. Always there had been another war, another king demanding service, another cause that required his sword and strength. He had served faithfully because honor demanded it, because his oath bound him to lords who saw valor in death and glory in conquest. But with each campaign, each battle, each fallen enemy who might have been friend under different stars, the weight of accumulated violence had grown heavier on his shoulders. The wolves sensed his darkening mood and moved closer, their warm presence offering the wordless comfort that had sustained him through 20 years of peaceful exile. Fenris rested his great head against Sten's knee while Skor positioned himself within easy reach, both animals offering the loyalty that asked no questions and demanded no justifications. When had he first begun to dream of walking away? Perhaps it was after the death of Ragnar Bluetooth, his shield brother and closest friend, whose throat was opened by a Saxon Sayax during the raid on Lindisfarne. Or maybe it had been earlier, during the sack of Rouen, when he found a young girl hiding in the ruins of her family's workshop, her eyes wide with terror as she waited for death that never came. Because even then, Sten Stormborn had grown weary of adding to the world's store of orphans. The decision to leave had crystallized slowly, like ice forming on a still pond. Each battle had added another layer of reluctance, another question about the true value of the glory that songs proclaimed eternal. When King Harold finally fell at Stamford Bridge, pierced by a lucky arrow from an English longbow, Sten had looked upon his lord's body and realized that he no longer possessed the will to serve another master in another endless war. The wolves had come to him during that dark time, appearing at his camp on the night after Harold's funeral. Pyre had burned to ashes. 2 black cubs, barely old enough to leave their mother, drawn by something he never fully understood. Perhaps they sensed a kindred spirit in a predator grown weary of hunting, or maybe the gods had sent them as companions for a man who needed reminding that not all bonds were forged in violence. He had raised them as his own sons, teaching them to hunt and fight and survive in a world that offered no mercy to the weak or foolish. They had learned well, becoming his shadows and protectors, bound to him by ties stronger than oath or blood. Together, they had built this sanctuary in the deep forest, seeking the peace that had eluded him throughout 4 decades of service to other men's ambitions. But peace, it seemed, was not a gift that stayed given. The world had a way of following even those who sought to leave it behind, carrying its violence and need and endless hunger into the quiet places, where old warriors hoped to find rest. Tonight had proven that some escapes were only temporary, that the skills learned in service to war could never truly be forgotten or set aside. The fire crackled softly in the great hearth, its light casting dancing shadows across the faded battle standard that had witnessed so much death and claimed to represent something noble in the taking of lives. 6 more men had died this night, 6 more names to add to the countless roster of those who had fallen before Sten Stormborn's blade. The weight of their deaths settled onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak, heavy with the accumulated sorrow of a lifetime spent in service to violence. The healing herbs, hanging in bundles from the rafters, released their fragrant oils into the still air as Sten ground fresh willow bark for Bjorn's pain. His massive hands worked the mortar and pestle with surprising gentleness, the same fingers that had wielded sword and axe now devoted to the preservation of life rather than its destruction. Beside him on the wooden table lay strips of clean linen and a clay pot of honey, tools for healing rather than harming. The young thief had awakened twice during the night, his fevered mumblings speaking of hunger and cold and a sister who waited in a village whose name Sten did not recognize. Each time, the old warrior had spooned broth between the boy's cracked lips and adjusted the bandages that bound his mangled arm, performing the same careful ministrations he would have shown any wounded creature that found its way to his door. Dawn approached through the shattered remnants of his sanctuary, its pale light revealing the full extent of the damage wrought by desperate men and necessary violence. Overturned furniture lay scattered across the great hall like the bones of some massive beast, and dark stains marked the floorboards where blood had soaked into timber that would never again be truly clean. The iron hinges of his door hung twisted and broken, leaving his home open to wind and weather and any who might choose to enter uninvited. Fenris lifted his great head from where he lay beside the unconscious thief, his yellow eyes meeting Sten's with the wordless communication that marked their long partnership. The wolf had appointed himself guardian over the wounded boy, perhaps recognizing in the young man's helplessness an echo of the cubs they themselves had once been. His vigil had been constant through the dark hours, broken only when necessary to check the approaches to the longhouse or respond to sounds that might herald additional threats. Outside, Skoll maintained his patrol of the clearing, his massive form moving like liquid shadow between the ancient pines. 6 bodies lay wrapped in cloaks beneath the spreading branches of an oak that had witnessed centuries of similar violence, waiting for burial or burning as custom and practicality dictated. The wolves had dragged the corpses outside without being asked, understanding instinctively that the den should be cleansed of death's presence before healing could begin. Sten finished preparing the medicine and moved to check on his unwilling patient, noting the improved color in Bjorn's face and the steadier rhythm of his breathing. The boy would survive, though his sword arm would bear forever the marks of Fenris's jaws and serve him poorly in any future endeavors that required strength or precision. Perhaps that was mercy of a sort, A crippled thief might be forced to seek honest work if he possessed the wisdom to learn from his mistakes. The old warrior settled into his chair beside the hearth, accepting the cup of water that Fenris brought him with the careful precision that marked their daily rituals. The wolf's intelligence never ceased to amaze him, though he had long since stopped questioning the depth of understanding that lived behind those predatory eyes. They were more than animals, these companions of his exile, though what they truly were remained a mystery he had never felt compelled to solve. His reflection was interrupted by the soft groan that announced Bjorn's return to consciousness. The young man's eyes opened slowly, confusion and pain warring for dominance in his expression as he struggled to remember where he was and how he had come to be there. When memory returned, it brought with it a fear so profound that his entire body began to shake despite the warmth of the fire. "Peace, boy," Sten said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had once calmed frightened horses and wounded soldiers. "You are safe here, though your companions did not share your fortune." Bjorn's single good hand moved instinctively toward where his weapons should have been, then fell away as he realized the futility of resistance. His arm throbbed with each heartbeat, and the massive wolf that lay beside him seemed disinclined to permit any sudden movements. "You could have killed me," he whispered, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Why didn't you?" The question hung between them like smoke from the dying fire, carrying weight that exceeded its simple phrasing. Why indeed had Sten chosen mercy for one when he had granted death to 6? The answer lay partly in the boy's youth and partly in the instinctive recognition of potential redemption, but mostly in the weariness that had settled into his bones like winter frost. "Because killing you would not bring back your friends," Sten replied after a long moment of consideration. "Because you are young enough to learn better wisdom than that which brought you to my door. Because I have grown tired of adding to the world's store graves." Bjorn turned his head to study the scarred giant who tended him with such unexpected gentleness. The stories told in taverns spoke of Sten Stormborn as a figure from legend, a warrior whose blade had never known defeat and whose mercy was reserved only for those who earned it through valor in battle. Yet here sat that same legend, grinding herbs for a thief's pain and speaking of weariness rather than glory. "The others," Bjorn began, then stopped as emotion closed his throat. He had known Magnus Ironbeard for 2 years, had fought beside him and shared bread from the same loaf during the long, hungry months when honest work proved impossible to find. Thorvald had taught him to use a blade, and Einar had shared stories of the wife and children he hoped to see again when spring brought the possibility of honest employment. "They died as warriors," Sten said, understanding the unasked question that lived behind the boy's tears. "Quickly, without dishonor, fighting to the end for what they believed was right. Magnus especially showed courage in the final moments, and I made certain his death was clean." The words brought little comfort, but they offered the dignity that custom demanded for the fallen. Bjorn had seen enough violence to understand the difference between a good death and a bad one, had witnessed the suffering that came to those who fell into the hands of men with neither honor nor mercy. That his friends had died fighting rather than begging represented something precious in a world that offered few guarantees of noble endings. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Will you turn me over to the Earl's men? Will you demand Weregild for the damage we have done?" Sten considered the question while his fingers worked automatically to rebind the boy's wounded arm. Justice demanded punishment for crimes committed, but what justice truly served when the punishment would accomplish nothing beyond adding more suffering to an already sorrowful world? The Earl's men would hang a one-armed thief without ceremony, and the boy's death would feed no hungry children or ease no grieving widows. "When you are healed enough to travel," the old warrior said slowly, "you will leave this place and never return. You will speak to no one of what transpired here, and you will seek honest work with whatever skills remain to you. If you choose instead to return to thievery, our paths will cross again, and my mercy will not extend to a second meeting." The terms were generous beyond anything Bjorn had dared hope for, yet they carried the weight of absolute finality that made any thought of betrayal seem like madness. He nodded his understanding, knowing that he had been granted a gift more precious than gold, the chance to build a better life from the ruins of his mistakes. Outside, the sun climbed higher through skies that promised another day of peace in the deep forest. But peace, Sten reflected as he watched over his unlikely charge, was not the absence of violence, but the strength to choose mercy when violence would be easier. Today, for the first time in many years, he had made that choice consciously and deliberately, and found in it a satisfaction deeper than any victory song had ever provided. The healing herbs continued their work, mending flesh that had been torn and easing pain that went deeper than wounded muscle and bone. In the quiet of his sanctuary, an old warrior learned that mercy could be its own form of strength, and that redemption sometimes came disguised as the enemy who lay helpless beside your hearth. The ancient collar around Fenris's neck bore runic inscriptions so old that even Sten, schooled in the lore of 3 kingdoms, could decipher only fragments of their meaning. He had never questioned their presence before, accepting them as remnants of some previous owner who had carved symbols he did not recognize into leather that seemed never to age or crack. But as morning light fell across the wolf's massive form, the runes began to glow with a pale silver radiance that made the air itself seem to shimmer. Bjorn's sharp intake of breath drew Sten's attention to what the boy could see from his position beside the hearth. The young thief's eyes were wide with terror and wonder as he stared at Fenris, whose yellow gaze had taken on an otherworldly depth that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of any natural creature. Beside him, Skoll bore a matching collar, its own runes pulsing with the same ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the wolves themselves, rather than any external source. "What are they?" Bjorn whispered, his wounded arm forgotten in the face of this revelation that transformed his understanding of everything that had transpired during the night. "What manner of creatures did you bind to your service?" Sten rose slowly from his chair, a deep weariness settling into his bones as memories he had deliberately buried began to surface like drowned bodies rising from dark water. The truth he had hidden from himself for 20 years could no longer be denied, not when the evidence glowed before his eyes with the unmistakable radiance of divine intervention. "They were never bound," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a burden he had refused to acknowledge. "I did not choose them. They chose me." The memory came flooding back with crystal clarity, every detail preserved as if it had happened yesterday rather than 2 decades past. He had been camped beside the River Tyne 3 days after King Harold's death at Stamford Bridge, when the vision came to him in the hour before dawn. An old woman had appeared at the edge of his firelight, her single eye gleaming with the wisdom of ages and her ravens perched upon her shoulders like living shadows. She had spoken no words of greeting, offered no explanation for her presence. Instead, she had simply held out a leather bag that seemed to pulse with its own inner life. "For services rendered," she had said in a voice like winter wind through bare branches, "and for services yet to come." Inside the bag were 2 wolf cubs, black as midnight, and already bearing the collars that marked them as something beyond the merely natural. Their eyes held intelligence that belonged to no ordinary beasts, and when they looked upon him, Sten felt the weight of recognition that spoke of destiny rather than chance encounter. "The Allfather's hounds," the woman had continued, though Sten had not heard that name spoken aloud since his grandfather's time. "Guardians for one who has served faithfully and earned the right to rest. They will know your enemies before you do, and they will stand between you and harm until your thread is finally cut by the Norns." He had tried to ask questions then, to understand the price that would surely come with such a gift, but when he looked up from the cubs in his hands, the woman was gone as if she had never been there at all. Only the wolves remained, and the knowledge that his life had been changed in ways he could not yet comprehend. The truth of their nature had revealed itself gradually over the years that followed. They grew faster and larger than any natural wolves, their intelligence manifesting in ways that defied explanation. They hunted with supernatural precision, communicated without sound, and seemed to sense danger long before human senses could detect any threat. Most telling of all, they aged not at all in the 20 years since their arrival, remaining in their prime while Sten's hair turned white and his joints stiffened with the passage of time. Now, as the runes on their collars blazed with increasing intensity, the final veil fell away from mysteries he had chosen not to examine too closely. These were not wolves at all, but something far older and more terrible. Creatures from the age of legends, when gods walked among men, and the boundaries between mortal and divine remained fluid and permeable. Bjorn's voice cracked with barely controlled fear as understanding dawned in his young mind. "You're under the protection of the gods themselves. We didn't attack an old hermit. We violated sacred ground and assaulted one whom the gods have marked as their own." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom, carrying implications that reached far beyond the simple violence that had shattered Sten's peaceful evening. If the boy spoke truly, and the evidence of divine intervention glowed before them in runic script older than kingdoms, then last night's battle had been more than a struggle between thieves and hermit. It had been a test, a trial by combat, where the stakes involved far more than silver or survival. Sten felt the weight of that realization settling upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from destiny itself. He had thought himself retired from the affairs of gods and kings, had believed that his service was ended and his obligations discharged. But the presence of divine guardians suggested otherwise, implied that his thread remained tangled in the great tapestry of fate despite his efforts to cut himself free. "I never asked for their protection," he said aloud, though whether he spoke to Bjorn or to powers that might be listening remained unclear. "I sought only peace, only the right to grow old without blood on my hands." Fenris rose from his position beside the injured thief and padded across the hall to stand before his human companion, the glow from his collar casting strange shadows on the timber walls. When he looked up at Sten, his eyes held depths that spoke of understanding far beyond that of any mortal creature. Understanding and something that might have been compassion. The wolf's massive head pressed against Sten's hand with gentle insistence, and suddenly the old warrior could feel the bond that connected them with perfect clarity. It was not mere affection or loyalty that bound them together, but something far deeper. A connection that transcended species and mortality, linking his fate to forces that moved according to patterns too vast for human comprehension. Skoll joined his brother, completing the triangle that had sustained them through 20 years of exile. Together, they formed something greater than the sum of their parts, a unity of purpose that served powers older than kingdoms and more enduring than any mortal ambition. Sten had been chosen, marked, and protected whether he willed it or not, his destiny intertwined with creatures whose true nature defied understanding. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through his contemplation like thunder on a clear day. Through the shattered doorway came running the last person Sten expected to see. Eric the merchant, his face pale with terror and his breath coming in short gasps from the effort of his desperate climb up the mountain path. "Lord Sten," the merchant panted, falling to his knees just inside the threshold. "Forgive me, I beg you. I never meant for this to happen. I was drunk, speaking carelessly, and my words were overheard by men who should not have heard them." Behind him, visible through the morning mist, came a sight that explained the urgency of his arrival and the terror in his eyes. A column of armed men moved through the forest with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, their shields bearing the device of Earl Ragnar Bloodaxe, the same lord who had once called Sten Stormborn brother and ally in the wars of their youth. The merchant's careless words had not merely attracted 7 desperate thieves seeking easy plunder. They had awakened something far more dangerous, the attention of ambitious men who remembered the legends and wondered what treasures might be worth the risk of confronting a living myth. As the glow from the wolves' collars intensified in response to approaching threat, Sten understood that his 20 years of peace had not been respite, but preparation. The gods had given him guardians not to ensure his retirement, but to prepare him for battles yet to come. The test was far from over, and the stakes had just grown immeasurably higher. Thor's hammer pendant rested against Sten's chest with the weight of sacred metal touched by divine fire, its surface growing warm as storm clouds gathered overhead with unnatural speed. He had worn the silver Mjolnir since his youth, a gift from his grandfather who claimed it had been blessed in the great temple at Uppsala, but never before had it responded to approaching danger with such unmistakable intensity. The pendant pulsed with each beat of his heart, its ancient runes glowing with the same ethereal light that now emanated from his wolves' collars. Through the shattered doorway, Sten could see Earl Ragnar's men deploying with the practiced efficiency of veterans who had fought in formation across the known world. 20 warriors in mail and helm, their shields locked and spears presented, commanded by a lord whose reputation for cunning matched his skill with blade and axe. These were not desperate thieves driven by hunger, but professional killers who served a master wealthy enough to equip them well and experienced enough to lead them wisely. Eric the merchant cowered beside the cold hearth, his earlier terror now transformed into something approaching panic as he realized the magnitude of forces he had set in motion through careless words and too much ale. "Lord Sten," he pleaded, his voice cracking with strain, "Earl Ragnar speaks of old debts and ancient obligations. He claims you possess something that belongs by right to the crown, something that was never yours to take." Sten's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night. Ragnar had not come seeking mere treasure, but something far more valuable. The location of King Harold's lost hoard, the royal treasury that had vanished after Stamford Bridge and never been recovered despite 20 years of searching by ambitious lords and desperate kings. The fool believed that Sten knew where it lay hidden, that proximity to the throne had granted him knowledge of secrets that had died with Harold himself. The irony was bitter as winter wind. Sten had indeed known of secret hoards and hidden treasures, had been privy to conversations between kings and counselors about wealth cached against uncertain times. But that knowledge had died with his decision to walk away from the world of ambition and warfare, buried as deeply as the treasures themselves beneath 20 years of deliberate forgetting. "Sten Stormborn," Earl Ragnar's voice carried clearly across the clearing, its tone mixing respect with unmistakable threat. "I would speak with you under the old customs, shield brother to shield brother, as men of honor have always done when the ravens gather." The formal challenge could not be ignored without loss of honor that would shame not only Sten, but the memory of every warrior who had ever stood beside him in the shield wall. Custom demanded that he respond, though the nature of that response remained his to choose. He could meet Ragnar in single combat, as tradition suggested, or he could refuse the challenge and face the consequences of being named coward before witnesses who would carry that verdict to every hall and hearth in the north. Fenris and Skoll flanked him as he stepped through the ruined doorway, their massive forms radiating power that made the very air shimmer with otherworldly energy. The runes on their collars blazed like captured starlight, and their yellow eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of any mortal creature. Behind them, storm clouds continued their unnatural gathering, blocking out the sun and casting the clearing into premature twilight. Earl Ragnar stood at the center of his formation, his gray-streaked beard and scarred face marking him as a veteran of countless battles who had earned his position through strength and cunning rather than birth alone. He wore mail that had been polished to mirror brightness, and his shield bore the device of the blood-red axe that had become synonymous with his name throughout the northern kingdoms. When he saw Sten emerge from the longhouse, genuine surprise flickered across his weathered features. "By the gods," Ragnar breathed, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the forest. The songs spoke truly. You have not aged a day since Stamford Bridge. What bargains have you struck with powers beyond the world of men?" The question hung between them like a blade waiting to fall, carrying implications that reached far beyond mere curiosity about the passage of years. Ragnar's eyes had fixed upon the wolves with the recognition of a man who knew legend from mere story, who understood that he faced something far more dangerous than a simple hermit with fighting skills that time had not dimmed. "I have struck no bargains," Sten replied, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded armies and counseled kings. "What you see before you is the will of powers that require no mortal's consent to act as they choose." Thunder rumbled overhead as if summoned by his words, and lightning flickered between the clouds with increasing frequency. The storm that gathered above them bore no resemblance to any natural weather, its fury building with supernatural intensity that spoke of divine attention focused upon events unfolding in this remote clearing. Bjorn the Weasel appeared in the doorway behind Sten, his wounded arm bound close to his chest, but his young face set with determination that surprised even himself. The boy had listened to the exchange between lords and understood that he stood witness to events that would echo through legend and song for generations yet unborn. Whatever fear he felt had been overwhelmed by the recognition that his testimony might someday matter to those who came after. "You know why I've come," Ragnar continued, though his earlier confidence had been shaken by the sight of creatures whose nature defied rational explanation. "The crown's treasury vanished with Harold's death, and many believe you alone possessed knowledge of its location. The realm needs that wealth, Sten. Kings have fallen for lack of silver to pay their warriors, and winter presses hard upon lands already weakened by poor harvests. The appeal to duty and necessity carried weight that mere greed could never match, but Sten heard in it echoes of every justification that ambitious men had ever offered for their desire to possess what others had hidden away. Gold called to Ragnar's heart, despite the noble words he used to mask its song, and the presence of 20 armed warriors spoke to intentions that went far beyond peaceful negotiation. "If such knowledge ever existed," Sten said carefully, "it died with the king I served. I took nothing from Harold's halls, save the scars earned in his service and the right to walk away when duty no longer called." The wind began to rise as he spoke, carrying with it the scent of rain and the electric tang that preceded lightning strikes. The wolves pressed closer to his sides, their forms beginning to blur at the edges as if they existed only partially in the mortal world. Power gathered around them like a visible presence, and even Ragnar's disciplined warriors shifted uneasily as they sensed forces beyond their understanding. "Pretty words," the Earl replied, though doubt had crept into his voice as he watched the supernatural display building around his former shield brother. "But words will not feed hungry children or pay the warriors who guard the realm against Danish raiders. If you will not share what you know willingly, perhaps pain will loosen your tongue where honor has failed." It was the threat that Sten had expected, the inevitable conclusion of any negotiation that began with armed men and appeals to necessity. Ragnar had come prepared for violence, perhaps even preferring it to the uncertainties of peaceful resolution. The Earl's reputation had been built upon successful raids and calculated brutality, and he would not easily abandon tactics that had served him well throughout a lifetime of profitable warfare. The hammer pendant against Sten's chest grew hot enough to brand flesh, its ancient blessing responding to the proximity of battle with divine fury that had slept for decades. Around him, the supernatural storm continued to build toward some inevitable climax, and the wolves at his side began to change in ways that mortal eyes could barely comprehend. High above, thunder spoke with the voice of gods, awakening to mortal events that had caught their attention. The test was about to begin in earnest, and 20 years of peace would be paid for, with interest measured in blood and lightning. Lightning split the darkened sky as Sten reached behind the great hearth to grasp the handle of his true weapon, The lightning-blessed axe that had lain hidden for 20 years beneath layers of concealment and deliberate forgetting. The weapon emerged from its resting place with a sound like singing steel, its double-edged head crackling with the same electric fury that danced between the storm clouds overhead. Runes carved deep into the iron blade blazed with divine fire, each symbol pulsing in rhythm with the thunder that shook the ancient timbers of the longhouse. This was no simple war axe forged by mortal smiths, but Grimfang itself, the weapon gifted to him by King Harold on the eve of their greatest victory, blessed by priests of the old gods and touched by lightning from Thor's own hammer. Its edge had never dulled in 40 years of warfare. Its balance remained perfect despite countless battles, and its hunger for the blood of enemies had only grown stronger during the long years of enforced peace. Earl Ragnar's eyes widened as he recognized the legendary weapon, understanding too late the true magnitude of the force he had chosen to challenge. "Grimfang," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer to gods who might no longer be listening. The songs claimed it was buried with Harold at Stamford Bridge. "Songs lie as often as they tell truth," Sten replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the howling wind that had begun to tear the surrounding trees. "But some gifts cannot be buried, even when their bearers wish for nothing more than peace." The storm above responded to the weapon's awakening with renewed fury, lightning striking the earth around the clearing with increasing frequency and intensity. Each bolt seemed drawn to the axe itself, adding to its power rather than threatening its wielder, and the very air crackled with energy that made mortal flesh tingle with proximity to divine forces. Fenris and Skoll underwent their own transformation as the battle began in earnest, their forms expanding beyond the merely physical into something that existed partially in the realm of legend and partially in the world of flesh and blood. Their eyes blazed with the fire of distant stars, their fangs gleamed like polished silver, and their voices raised a howl that spoke of winter winds and the wild hunt that rode the skies during the longest nights of the year. Ragnar's warriors formed their shield wall with practiced precision, but even veteran soldiers trained to face human enemies showed visible fear when confronted with creatures whose nature defied rational explanation. Spear points wavered despite iron discipline, and more than one man whispered prayers to gods whose attention had already been claimed by forces gathering in the supernatural storm. "Stand fast," Ragnar commanded, though his own voice carried an edge of uncertainty that had not been there moments before. "They are flesh and blood, whatever sorcery surrounds them. Steel can kill anything that walks the earth, and we have steel enough for any task." The Earl raised his own weapon, a fine blade inherited from his father and grandfather before him, and advanced towards Sten with the controlled aggression of a man who had never retreated from any foe. Behind him, his warriors maintained formation despite the unnatural phenomena swirling around them, their loyalty to their lord overcoming the primitive terror that urged them to flee. The first clash came with the sound of thunder itself. Grimfang meeting Ragnar's sword in a shower of sparks that illuminated the darkened clearing like captured lightning. The Earl was skilled. His reputation had been earned through decades of successful warfare, but he faced an opponent whose strength had been magnified by divine blessing and whose weapon carried the fury of the storm itself. Sten moved with fluid grace that belied his years, each stroke of the lightning-blessed axe creating trails of fire through the rain-soaked air. Ragnar gave ground before the assault, his superior technique barely sufficient to turn aside blows that would have shattered lesser weapons and killed any man who tried to block them directly. Around them, the supernatural wolves engaged Ragnar's warriors with devastating effect. Fenris moved like liquid shadow among the packed ranks, his massive jaws closing on shield arms and sword hands with surgical precision that left enemies disarmed, but not necessarily dead. Skoll circled the formation's flanks, his presence alone sufficient to prevent any coordinated advance or retreat that might give the soldiers tactical advantage. The storm continued to build overhead, each lightning strike adding to the power that flowed through Sten's weapon and the divine fury that sustained his companions. Rain began to fall in sheets that turned the battlefield to treacherous mud, but neither man nor wolf lost footing on ground that seemed to steady itself beneath their feet while remaining slippery for their enemies. Young Bjorn watched from the doorway of the longhouse, his wounded arm forgotten as he witnessed events that would live in memory and song long after all present had joined their ancestors in whatever halls awaited the honored dead. The merchant Eric cowered beside him, his earlier terror transformed into awe at forces beyond mortal comprehension. 3 of Ragnar's warriors fell in the first exchange, not dead, but broken in ways that would prevent further participation in battle. The supernatural wolves fought with precision rather than savagery, disabling rather than slaughtering, showing mercy that their enemies had not expected from creatures of legend and nightmare. But Ragnar himself proved more formidable than his followers, his blade work improving as desperation lent strength to skill and survival instincts honed by 30 years of warfare. He managed to land a shallow cut across Sten's ribs, drawing first blood and proving that even legends could be wounded by mortal steel wielded with sufficient determination. "You have grown soft in your hermit's cave," the Earl panted, circling warily as he sought opening for another attack. 20 years ago, that thrust would never have found its mark. 20 years ago, Sten replied, calmly, testing the minor wound with fingers that came away red with his own blood. "I would have killed you in the first exchange. Age brings wisdom as well as slower reflexes." The truth of that statement became apparent as the battle continued, Sten's tactical brilliance compensating for any diminishment in pure physical capability. He fought with the patience of experience rather than the fury of youth, conserving strength while his opponent exhausted himself in increasingly desperate attacks that failed to penetrate defenses built upon decades of hard-won knowledge. The silence that followed the storm's passing was more profound than any sound, a hush so complete that it seemed to embrace the forest clearing like a blessing from the gods themselves. Where moments before lightning had danced between the clouds and thunder had shaken the very foundations of the earth, now only the gentle patter of ordinary rain marked the return to the world of mortal concerns. Earl Ragnar lay upon his back in the mud, his fine blade shattered beside him and his chest rising and falling with the labored breathing of a man who had looked into the depths of his own mortality and found them wanting. Grimfang rested against his throat with its edge drawing a thin line of crimson, the lightning-blessed axe having finally found the opening that experience and divine favor had created. "Yield," Sten said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had once commanded armies and counseled kings. "You fought with honor, Ragnar. There is no shame in acknowledging defeat when the gods themselves have chosen sides." Around them, the remnants of the Earl's war band knelt in the mud with their weapons cast aside, bearing witness to the outcome of a contest that had transcended mere mortal combat. 15 men remained of the 20 who had entered the clearing with such confidence, their mail torn and their pride humbled, but their lives intact through the mercy of creatures who could have slaughtered them all with casual ease. Fenris and Skoll stood among the defeated warriors, like shadows given substance, their forms already beginning to fade back toward the merely physical, as the supernatural storm dissipated into memory. The glow from their runic collars dimmed to barely perceptible gleaming, and their eyes lost the stellar fire that had marked them as something beyond the natural world. Yet even in this diminished state, none of Ragnar's men dared to meet their gaze directly. The Earl himself studied Sten's face with the calculating expression of a veteran who recognized superior force when it stared him in the eyes. Pride warred with pragmatism in features that had commanded respect throughout the northern kingdoms, but survival instincts honed by 3 decades of successful warfare finally prevailed over wounded dignity. "I yield," Ragnar said formally, his voice carrying clearly despite his prone position and the weight of defeat that pressed upon his chest like Sten's axe. "I acknowledge your victory and submit myself to whatever mercy you choose to grant." Sten lifted Grimfang from the Earl's throat and stepped back, allowing his former adversary to rise with whatever dignity remained to him after witnessing forces that transformed legend into irrefutable reality. The lightning-blessed axe no longer crackled with divine energy, its supernatural fury spent in service to powers that had judged the contest and found it concluded according to their will. "There will be no Sergild demanded for this day's work," Sten declared, his words carrying to every man present with the finality of judgment rendered by higher authority. "You came seeking treasure that was never mine to give, pursuing knowledge that died with better men than either of us. Return to your halls and trouble me no more." The merchant Eric emerged from the longhouse on unsteady legs, his face pale with the aftermath of terror, but his eyes bright with the recognition that he had witnessed events worthy of saga and song. Behind him came young Bjorn, his wounded arm bound close to his chest, but his expression holding wonder rather than fear as he gazed upon the aftermath of divine intervention. "The treasure you sought was never silver or gold," Sten continued, addressing Ragnar but speaking for the benefit of all who heard. "It was the wisdom to know when enough blood has been shed, when enough glory has been earned, when the time has come to lay down the sword and seek peace rather than conquest." Thunder rumbled once more in the distance, a final acknowledgement from powers beyond mortal understanding that justice had been served according to ancient laws that predated kingdoms and would outlast the memory of any king. The storm moved on toward other battles and other judgments, leaving behind only the gentle rain that would wash away the blood and return the clearing to the peaceful silence that had reigned before ambition and necessity had intruded upon sanctuary. Ragnar struggled to his feet with the careful movements of a man whose body bore fresh reminders of mortality's limitations. His scarred face showed no anger at defeat, only the thoughtful expression of a veteran who had learned something valuable about the true nature of power and the price of challenging forces beyond human comprehension. "I understand now," he said slowly, his gaze moving from Sten to the wolves that flanked him like living shadows. "You are not hiding from the world. You are protecting it from yourself. The gods have marked you as their own, and woe to any who would drag you back into the affairs of mortal men." The Earl gathered his surviving warriors with the quiet efficiency of a leader who understood that retreat was sometimes the wisest form of victory. They departed as they had come, in formation and with discipline intact, despite the humbling they had endured. But their bearing spoke of men who had been changed by what they witnessed, who would carry with them the memory of divine intervention and the knowledge that some legends lived and breathed among the ancient trees. As the sound of their departure faded into the depths of the forest, Sten felt the familiar weight of solitude settling upon his shoulders once more. The clearing seemed larger somehow, emptied not just of enemies but of the certainty that his exile could continue undisturbed. Today had proven that the past could never be completely buried, that reputation and legend possessed a life of their own that no amount of peaceful intention could entirely suppress. The wolves sensed his mood and moved closer, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained him through 20 years of chosen isolation. Their collars had returned to simple leather worked with symbols that meant nothing to casual observation, but the memory of their true nature would never again be forgotten or denied. Silence returned to the forest, as it had always done after violence passed. But it was a different silence now, one that acknowledged change rather than promising eternal peace. 3 days after Earl Ragnar's departure, new stories began to spread through the villages below like ripples on a still pond, each telling growing richer in detail with every hearth where they were shared. The merchant Eric, sobered by his brush with forces beyond mortal understanding, spoke carefully of an old hermit whose hospitality should never be abused, whose peace should never be disturbed. But others who had not witnessed divine intervention firsthand embellished his restrained account with details born of imagination and ancient memory. Sten worked steadily to repair his shattered door, selecting each timber with the care of a craftsman who understood that some tasks served purposes beyond mere necessity. The new hinges were stronger than the old, forged from iron that had felt the touch of supernatural fire and been tempered by experience harder than any smith's hammer. When completed, the barrier would stand against more than weather and wandering beasts. It would serve as a symbol of boundaries that wise men would not cross. Fenris and Skoll maintained their vigil at the edges of the clearing, their patrol routes unchanged, but their alertness heightened by the knowledge that their sanctuary's location was no longer the closely guarded secret it had once been. The wolves moved with the fluid grace that marked their kind, but their yellow eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of any natural creature. They bore their divine nature more openly now, no longer constrained by the need to appear as simple animals to mortal observers. Young Bjorn had departed on the second morning, his wounded arm bound in a proper sling fashioned from cloth that Sten had woven during the peaceful years of his exile. The boy carried with him more than healing herbs and careful instructions for tending his injury. He bore the weight of choices that would determine whether his brush with legend would transform him into something better than the desperate thief who had kicked down a stranger's door. "Remember," had been Sten's final words to the youth as he prepared to descend the mountain path toward whatever future awaited him in the world below. Every man deserves a second chance, but few receive a third. Choose wisely what you do with the gift you have been given. The boy had nodded solemnly, his young eyes holding understanding that spoke of hard lessons learned and wisdom bought with pain. He would carry scars from this encounter for the remainder of his days, but perhaps they would serve as reminders of the cost of poor choices and the value of mercy freely given. Now, as evening approached and shadows lengthened across the clearing, Sten sat once more beside his hearth with a cup of ale and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the great tapestry of fate. The fire crackled softly in the rebuilt grate, its warmth driving away the chill of approaching autumn and casting dancing patterns across walls that had witnessed violence and emerged stronger for the testing. The longhouse felt different now, its atmosphere changed by events that had stripped away the illusion of perfect isolation and replaced it with something more complex, but no less valuable. This was still his sanctuary, still the refuge where an old warrior could find peace away from the endless conflicts that marked the world of ambitious men. But it was also acknowledged now as something more. A place where legend dwelt, where divine favor rested, where ancient powers maintained their watch over matters that concerned gods as well as mortals. Eric the merchant would return in spring, as had become his custom over the years, but their relationship would never again be that of simple craftsman and trader. The merchant's careless words had triggered events that revealed truths better left hidden, and though Sten bore him no malice for the unintended consequences, trust once broken could never be entirely mended. Future dealings would be conducted with the careful formality due to one whose nature transcended the merely human. Word would spread, as word always did, carrying tales of the hermit who commanded wolves and wielded lightning, of the old warrior who had faced an earl's war band and emerged victorious through divine intervention. Some would dismiss such stories as tavern tales embellished for the entertainment of credulous audiences, but others would listen with the attention due to accounts that bore the ring of truth. A few might even be foolish enough to test the tales for themselves, drawn by greed or curiosity or the simple human need to measure themselves against legend. Sten would be ready for them, as he had been ready for the thieves whose desperation had led them to his door and the earl whose ambition had driven him to seek treasure that existed only in imagination. But most, he believed, would show the wisdom that desperate men often lacked. Most would hear the stories and choose to seek their fortunes elsewhere, to trouble other quarry, less well protected and less capable of defending itself. The tales would serve as a barrier more effective than walls or weapons, creating the peace that Sten valued above silver or gold. The wolves settled beside his chair as full darkness claimed the forest, their massive forms radiating warmth and the quiet contentment that came to predators whose territory was secure. Their collars bore runic inscriptions that glowed faintly in the firelight, reminders of divine attention that would never again be forgotten or denied. They were his companions still, his family and guardians, but also something more, bridges between the mortal world and powers that shaped destiny according to patterns too vast for human understanding. Outside, the night sounds of the forest resumed their ancient rhythms, creatures great and small going about their business in the darkness that held no terrors for those who belonged to it. An owl called from the great oak where 6 thieves had found their rest beneath earth that would know their names no longer, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled in greeting to cousins who shared its blood if not its nature. Sten raised his cup in silent salute to the darkness beyond his windows, acknowledging forces that had shaped his fate and would continue to guide his steps until the Norns finally cut the thread of his existence. He had sought peace and found it, lost it to the necessities of violence, and discovered it again in forms more complex but no less precious than what he had known before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors perhaps, new tests of the boundaries he had established around his chosen sanctuary. But tonight brought the deep satisfaction that came to men who had found their proper place in the grand design of fate, who understood their roles in patterns that extended far beyond individual desire or ambition. The fire burned low as the night deepened, its embers glowing like distant stars in the darkness that embraced the longhouse and all who dwelt within its walls. In the morning there would be work to do, repairs to complete, preparations to make for whatever trials the future might bring. But for now, there was only peace and the quiet knowledge that some legends never truly end. They simply find new ways to continue their eternal watch over a world that needs guardians more than it needs heroes. The stories told by firelight in distant halls would preserve this day's events in memory and song, ensuring that the name of Sten Stormborn would live as long as men gathered to share tales of courage and divine intervention. And in a forest clearing where ancient pines whispered secrets to the wind, an old warrior and his wolves kept vigil over mysteries that time could never diminish, legends that death could never silence, and truths that would endure long after kingdoms fell to dust and even the gods themselves were forgotten.